Hi, everyone, and welcome to our panel on a new federal theater project. My name is J.R. Pierce. I am the associate editor of American Theater Magazine. I am also a freelance critic. My byline's been in the Chicago Tribune. You'll find my name under Jerald Raymond Pierce, my full name, but JR is fine. To start, I would just like to give a little bit of background on the Federal Theater Project. As you may or may not know, it was a works program created as part of the Works Progress Administration and existed from 1939 to a really abrupt end, or 1935, excuse me, till a really abrupt end in 1939 when it was disbanded by Congress. Politicians at the time were both fearful that it could become some sort of Red Scare and threw around the insinuation that arts weren't real work to them. One congressman at the time was infamously quoted as saying, "Let them have a pick and shovel," instead of funding the arts work that we all know is actual work. So here to discuss what a new federal theater project could look like in the year 2021 and forward, I have three wonderful panelists that I will allow to introduce themselves. They'll give you their name, their pronoun, and a little bit of background on who they are and the work they do. Let's kick it off with Lear.
Hello, so good to be here today with you all. I'm Lear deBessonet, she, her pronouns, and I'm currently the artistic director of Encores at New York City Center. I founded the Public Works program at the Public Theater, which is now in its 9th year. And my background is really as a community-based arts practitioner. And my focus has been thinking about the way that arts exists as a portal to community wellness and the ways that art can come alongside other social justice work to do things that only art can do. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I know Jordan's work is based in community as well. So let's head over to Jordan.
Thanks, JR. I'm, again, also really excited to be here. My name's Jordan Seaberry. I use he, him pronouns. I do want to just quickly mention the place I call home. We call Providence, Rhode Island. It's the traditional lands and the rightful lands of the Wampanoag and the Narragansett nations. And from here, I am lucky to serve as co-director of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, which may not surprise you to know is not a real federal agency. We call ourselves a people-powered department. We see ourselves as a grassroots action network. We are geared to incite creativity, to build social imagination, to try and shape a culture that's rooted in empathy and equity and belonging across all art forms broadly defined. Really a sort of provocation, asking, why doesn't a U.S. Department of Arts and Culture exist? And thinking specifically about the legacies of the WPA and other public service jobs program is something we've been really excited about over the years. So I'm really happy to dive in and share space with all of you today.
Thank you, Jordan. And when we're talking about the government, we have to go to Greg.
Hello, so I am calling from Washington, D.C., the land of the Piscataway peoples. And I use he, him pronouns. And yes, unlike Jordan, I actually am part of the federal government. And probably the closest thing the federal government has to a U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, which is the National Endowment for the Arts. So maybe we should just trade names, because I always get our name doesn't actually sound like it's the government agency. So we could somehow swap. We'll see if we can make that happen. But very happy to be here, part of this conversation.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Jordan, for bringing it up. And I'll say I'm calling from Chicago, on the lands of the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Miami, Sioux, and Peoria. Thank you. So to kick us off, I would love to, Greg, one of the things you said for the article that I wrote for American Theater about a new federal theater project that stuck with me ever since and was the thing I led off that article with. Everyone has a slightly different version of the federal theater project in mind when we talk about what does that mean for 2021. So I would love to ask you all, and we can just go around, I would love to ask you all, what does that look like when you're imagining a new federal theater project? When I say those words, what does that mean for you? How does that affect your job? What would the impact be on the work that you do for the community? We could start with, let's go with Jordan this time.
Sure, thanks, JR. So I think the context you're mentioning is important because it is true, it's well known in the 1930s with the Works Progress Administration, but also in the 1970s with the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, CETA. Both of those were not just governmental initiatives geared toward supporting the arts or building cultural change. They were our country's response to widespread unemployment that led directly to public service jobs. And so we know that our government has the framework and the capability to respond to economic and social issues through what I would argue are pretty creative, pretty meaningful responses. Both, the WPA and CETA put thousands of artists to work, not just creating traditional visual arts projects or theater projects, but really strengthening cultural infrastructure. And so for us at the USDAC, when we think about what that cultural infrastructure means moving forward, it's again, it's not just those traditional art forms, it's the matrix of ideas, of beliefs that really underpin policy and social action that allow policymakers to make bold steps, to make meaningful investments in creative communities and marginalized communities to right wrongs of the past. That cultural infrastructure is what allows for those new ideas to take root. So for us, we're excited because it represents an opportunity to step into the best future that we can have for this country.
Absolutely. And Lear, like you've founded a public works program, so I'm curious how something like a new federal theater project could help support that kind of work that you do.
Absolutely. Well, part of what I admire so deeply about both the WPA moment and the CETA moment that you referenced so beautifully, Jordan, is it feels like, in a sense, both of those efforts were moments where I see a huge amount of resource devoted to highly local work, highly specific local work that was really driven by the people who were already there, the artists who were already embedded in those communities. And it feels like though there was a relationship between the original FTP and what we might think of as institutional theaters, the regional theater movement had not happened yet. And in a lot of ways, it was both, it feels a bit scrappier than that, and a bit more grassroots in terms of really meeting people where they are and finding a way to get the resources in the form that serves that local work. I think about this sort of nimbleness and responsiveness, even of the descriptions of there was a flood in Ohio, and they had a group of actors in Ohio who showed up at the rescue centers and performed by lantern light on the tables for the families, for the kids that were waiting. And that's, again, it's a kind of nimbleness that it's so different than thinking about subscription models and trying to change the dynamics of, pursuing equity and pursuing anti-racism practices within the context of the institutional theater, where you're looking at boards, you're looking at audience. This is just it's a really different path than that, and one that I find hugely inspiring. And for me, when I think about what would it mean for it to be replicated now, and I know that that's, as you have pointed out, and as the article pointed out, and we've, I think, all said in different contexts, the same circumstances are not going to replicate. It was highly specific to that moment, and there's no question something different would need to happen now. But it feels like a massive resource for local artists that understands arts work as real work, and that is fundamentally about artists being situated in service of where they are, in service of their local community, working, holding hands with the other sort of forces for good that are there, right? Holding hands with community-based organizations and hospitals and schools and libraries and whatever local ecosystem makes, is present and makes sense. But that's what keeps me up in the morning about the Federal Theater Project.
And when we're talking about aspects of theater that weren't around in the original Federal Theater Project, and we're talking about distribution of funds and trying to get that to the local level, the NEA wasn't around. So Greg, how would you see the Federal Theater Project affecting your work?
It's definitely building on what's come before between the Federal Theater Project, the movement out of the 60s and 70s. We were, of course, founded in 1965 under President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty programs as an important part of what makes us uniquely American. And when I think about what we can do in terms of a federal theater project and really federal arts project, we have many, many artistic disciplines that are all extraordinary within what we support. I do think about what it means to be local, what's locally grown, what's coming out of individual communities. Our former chairwoman, Jane Chu, used to say, if you've seen one community, you've seen one community. And I think that's really true. So I also think about where our dollars going, that private philanthropy isn't going. If you look at a map of the top 1,000 foundations, this is a PowerPoint slide we developed for presentation last year. You can see that there are hundreds of counties and cities where private philanthropy is just not reaching, that our federal dollars are reaching, because we fund in every single congressional district in the country. And so I think that's super important. And I also think, as we move out of the pandemic era, I'm hoping one of the things we might be able to take away from that is a return to, as I said before, locally grown theater, where we're not just following the model, even though I know this is an event called BroadwayCon, we're not just following the model of importing the latest Broadway hit, actors and crew to a town for a few months at a time, who then all go back to New York, but we're cultivating, there is incredible local talent out there at every level in our country. And I also think, what's going to get me out of the couch and to put a mask on to be around other people in the next few months that I can't get on Netflix or streaming? And that's got to be some kind of connection with my local neighbors and community.
Definitely. And as we talk about community, I would love to ask you, Jordan, how theater's been having this issue throughout its history of trying to reach marginalized communities, especially being in Chicago. The big conversation in Chicago is that the majority of the major theaters, and especially the ones that get a lot of coverage, are on the north side. And so there's a big theatrical desert sometimes when you look at south and west sides of the city. So how can something like a new federal theater project help to reach those communities that might not otherwise be getting the same art access?
Really, really important question. I'm really happy you brought that. When we're thinking about what the framework can look like, I think there are viable structural models, both in the WPA and CETA, thinking about both the regional or local offices that are really replicating national initiatives, or the prime sponsor model, where those sort of locally embedded offices are really focusing on managing the public service employment dollars from the Department of Labor in CETA's case. Both models, I think, offer chances for regionalized versions, for state, for local versions, and some responsiveness. But for us, really, regardless of what that framework looks like, the critical challenge is persuading policymakers to be able to change some of the structures that make those communities so hard to access. And so for us, the thing that comes to my mind is our recent project, which is still ongoing, which we're calling the People's WPA, which is an initiative of the USDAC. It's a storytelling project with the goal of, again, convincing policymakers to invest in arts, culture, and what we're building is sort of newly imagined sectors of labor. And that's a cohort of 25 folks from hundreds of nominations and applications we got across the country, but with a really keen eye on diversity, geographic diversity. So we have folks, yes, we have projects in LA, we have some folks in New York, but we've also got organizers in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. We have folks working on reservations up in South Dakota. one group in particular, Sip Culture in Utica, Mississippi, some really incredible cultural organizing that's happening that in a lot of ways could be easy to miss if you're looking at it from that top-down perspective. For us, it is always about finding those grassroots artists and redefining, you know, it's for us, again, I know we keep using Broadway as sort of the example, but these elite arts institutions, which have the framework and the infrastructure to get that attention, it really is on us to be able to turn those dollars that support that attention down to the grassroots artists to make sure that we're amplifying back up.
Yeah, and I know, Lear,
Yes.
you have some great ideas around this as well, so please.
Oh, I was just losing my mind about the awesomeness of what you're describing, Jordan, including the shout out for Sip Culture. Yes. Yeah, I think this question, what you named as convincing policymakers sort of the value of it and changing the awareness. I feel like this is something that has been so deep over this past year as our field has been trying to make a case for itself, right, as part of COVID recovery and relief. And one of the things that just has not sat right with me is that it feels like the economic justifications of our value are real as well. Like all of the stats out there about what arts and culture contribute to the national economy is true. And yes, I want people to know those facts. But it also feels like there is a whole other story about the role that the impact of the arts on public health and education and community wellness that is just, I think, from a policy standpoint, and even, you know, if you're thinking about the way that the arts exist within the consciousness of folks in Congress, I think that there is not the right story isn't there. The like deep story of what we think the arts are and what they're here to do feels like it's too small. And even, you know, the fact that Greg, like the NEA should have a lot more money. The fact that the country right now is investing 1/3 of the budget of a Fast and Furious movie in arts for the entire country is unacceptable, right? That's just bananas. It's like even if they are going, Greg, as you said, to such geographically, you know, diverse communities, it still doesn't solve the fact that the actual pot that you're dealing with doesn't represent what this work can do in meeting some of the biggest societal challenges we have, including the profound equity challenges that have been laid bare by this pandemic. So how do we change that story is one of the, I think, questions before us.
Yeah, Greg, how do we change that story?
Well, first, thank you, Lear, for saying that. I can't, as a federal employee, I, of course, cannot advocate for increasing the budget of my own agency. So I will let other people make that case for us. But I will tell you—
That's why I did it, Greg. That's why I did it.
What I can tell you is that, you know, we have new leadership as of this year, January 20th, and they've brought in some very specific priorities for us coming from the priorities of the new administration. And they are, number one, rebuild the economy; two, heal the nation; and third, advance racial equity, access, and climate justice. So that's what's top of mind for our leadership right now. I don't know how that's going to, you know, we're figuring out what form that's going to take. Part of it will be, we got an extra $135 million this year specifically for recovery and reopening. So we're working on getting that out. And as you said, Lear, I know that's, you know, when you look at what other parts of the nation are, and industries are receiving, I won't say an opinion on it, but yes, that's not going to go that far. To give you
I will say there was a quote in my article calling your budget dust, so I will just leave that. as it is and
Yeah.
let you continue.
And I also don't want to, that's important to say. It's also, I don't want to minimize what we are able to do with that, with those funds and leveraging and how important it is. And to give you a sort of real dollar sense of just for theater, in an average year with our current annual budget, which is 165 million about this year, about 40% of that goes directly to state arts agencies. In terms of disciplines, about $6 million on average for the last 4 years or so has been going to theaters. Our average grant size is $20,000. So if you're like the organization I used to, one of the organizations I used to work for, Tectonic Theater Project, for an example, that makes a huge difference. The grant we received 1 year allowed us to do a tour of the Laramie Project 10 years later. So that can have a real impact. But of course, the more we have, the more we'll give out.
And I'm going to stick with you for a second, Greg. Is this vision, or these visions of a new federal theater project possible without government support? Like if foundations and corporations step up, can we still have this, or do we absolutely need the government to make this happen?
Without directly, without trying to skirt the line of what I can directly earn, I will say, as I said before, there are things that the federal government is uniquely able to do. We have an infrastructure, again, in all 56 states, territories, and districts, and relationships with arts councils. Every one of these entities has their own state or territory arts council or commission. So there are definitely, when you talk about scope and economies of scale, there are definitely things that we can do in leading an effort. And I'll use an example, the whole 10 years or so ago, when we were leading the movement towards creative placemaking. Now, it was important that we had partners like the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation on board for that effort, but we were able to lead a sort of shift in how we thought about arts and communities at that time. So yes, and I hope we're included. We have also an incredible staff of people who love the arts and have worked in the arts and now find themselves in the federal government. And like I said, relationships going out all over the country in ways that maybe private philanthropy didn't. The other thing I'll just say that I think is important about us as a federal agency, you can reach us. My email, reinerg@arts.gov, is on our website. So is my phone number. So is all of my colleagues. We will answer the phone. I can't tell you, trying to get on the other side of that door. When I used to run a theater to call a big foundation, they would almost, it's in most cases not possible. It's like, don't call us, don't call you. Whereas because we're part of the government, we are open, accessible, and anyone can call us, and we will call you back or take your call.
Yeah, and I'd love to go ahead, Jordan. Yeah,
I was just going to dive in with and flex a bit more flexibility than perhaps Greg can offer at that initial answer, which is, in my opinion, that not only do we need the government to be a meaningful player in this role, but it is how it should be. We should be able to expect that of our government as well. We should be able to frankly demand it. I think, to Lear's point about, we should not be determining the value of the arts solely as an economic engine. We shouldn't, the artistic value to society is not just that it brings in tourist dollars or museum tickets or theater tickets. It's that it builds empathy. It creates a sense of belonging. I think my background, I'm lucky to have painting practice. I'm a practicing artist, but I also worked for years as a public policy director. I've worked on writing and passing and fighting for legislation, organizing folks to testify, the whole process. And I know, I have seen, without that empathy, without that social imagination, there is no real civic agency. You cannot affect change without that creative aspect to your work. When people feel like they're seen, like they are heard, like they're understood, when community members know that their imaginations matter, they are able to bring their full selves to anything from a theater performance up to a judiciary committee hearing. It allows our country to be better. It makes our work more effective when we are imbuing arts and creativity in all of it. And so I think not only do we need the government to be leading on this and taking up the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, but it's also something that we want to demand. This name that we took is playful. It's a performance of a future agency, but it also is a provocation. We want to see that happen.
Absolutely. And I believe it's the World Health Organization that defines health as mental, physical, and social health. So we can't leave off the social part when thinking about what's good for society. Lear, I'd love to throw the question to you as well, and also throw in the idea of there are concerns from that I've heard from people and that are out there that the same thing could happen that happened back in the 30s, that the government could come along and look at any new federal theater project as, well, expendable. So how does that shape the conversation as well?
Yeah, I think, well, one of the complexities that we deal in is the fact that, data, and metrics are things that, sort of secure you from the position in the federal funding and impact sphere. And that is, those are just tricky things with the arts. I mean, one of the things for Public Works, we have had a brilliant linguistic anthropologist who's documented the work for the entire time, including as it started happening in other cities. And now there are 11 Public Works affiliates that each are shaped very, particularly for their local place. And her work has actually drawn me into the work of other folks documenting the impact of participation, which I want to come back to in a second. But I think part of the issue is that, in law and medicine, case studies are acceptable as the best form of reporting, right? Brown versus Board of Education was built on case studies, not on data as in percentages, right? It was actually studying the impact on real people. And I do feel like in making the case for the arts, ideally we would need to be able to make a case for the role for case studies playing a different role in documentation. But that is sort of a topic for maybe another moment. But it's just to say that one of the other things I learned, and this is about the impact of participation specifically, when someone is not just viewing, but actually involved in making themselves in a more holistic way, that we found pretty early on in Public Works. And I had actually done like a 2-year pilot in San Diego and a 2-year pilot before that in Philly, and had sort of noticed anecdotally some of these results. So again, I'm coming at this as an artist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a policy person, so I was just noticing impact in people's lives. And that was surprisingly concrete. I think about a wonderful man named Al, who we worked with in San Diego, who was a 55-year-old man, came to us through a homeless services organization, and had a lot of health issues and some mental issues. And basically, after being part of this artistic project, he got a job at first he got a job at Time Warner Cable, and we're still in touch. And he then later got a job at SeaWorld, but basically entered the workforce at age 56, had never had steady employment before that. And to an extent that really surprised me, he credited being part of this artistic project as something that intersected with his life. And I don't credit the arts project for making that change. He made that change. It was within him to do that. But there was something, which this is what I wanted to bring up as like this unique crucible of transformation that the arts can do, which is there is something about what sociologists have defined for a long time as like an ideal crucible of change, of breaking through past whatever the obstacles are in your life, is group enterprise that is high risk or high stakes within safe boundaries, which is, in my mind, a description of the theater, right? Or of the arts. And you can think about other situations that are really life-changing, but maybe not in a positive way, right? Like war is a group enterprise that is very high stakes, but not within safe boundaries, right? And the arts have this unique ability to do that. And I think, you know, once somebody has, even if it's for 3 weeks, if they have 20 hours a week that they're engaged in that artistic process, that is enough time to create that catalyst that they need to leap and to realize again what's already in them, what they already have waiting to come forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna, oh, go ahead, Jordan.
I have nothing to add. I just want to say I love that definition. I think it's spot on, beautiful. I'm sitting with it. I have nothing useful to say other than that.
That was useful. I love that. So I'd love to kind of stay with that thought. And we talked about the fact that we're at BroadwayCon, but as we're looking at this local aspect of what a new federal theater project could be, is there a trickle up effect that we could see how this, either audience based or in terms of the content we actually see, something like this would affect what we see on Broadway stages?
Boy, that's my hope, hugely, because what we're seeing now on Broadway stages, what we're looking at, and I'm going to say something, you can censor this if you want to, but I'm just going to say it. All white music, a musical about a jukebox musical about a aging rock star or a rock artist with an all white male creative team. We do not need that in our next post-pandemic world. So I hope that the incredible work that's happening in communities, that is really by, about, and for communities, that is decolonizing our practice, I hope that does rise to the top in Broadway, because I think that's what we need as individuals and as a nation right now.
Yeah, that's well said. I'll leave it open if Lear or Jordan, you wanted to add anything to that thought.
I'll just offer that I absolutely agree. That's the model that we took with the People's WPA, is exactly that. Sourcing that wisdom, finding the work that is already happening at the grassroots, not asking folks to take on new projects for a micro grant, but to find what's already happening, what bonds are being built, what new worlds and social imagination is taking place in grassroots communities across the country. And it's our responsibility with this national reach to bubble that up to the top, to amplify it out, to be able to build support for that. And we have seen, time and again, that it is the grassroots movements, those slow culture changes that make big ripple effects. I mean, we thinking about that cultural infrastructure, we have a growing consciousness around the need to protect our planet from climate change. That conversation, that discourse has changed radically just in the last decade, just in the last 5 years. And that is, I mean, you can credit it to a ton of different reasons, but I really see the driving force behind that culture shift being folks, primarily Indigenous organizers, primarily Indigenous women organizers, putting their bodies on the line time and again, organizing and slowly shifting that culture up. So now, yes, the new federal administration, folks in Congress have this different consciousness around this issue, which has been known. That wisdom has been there at the grassroots all along. We just needed to build the infrastructure for it to be heard, for folks to be listened to.
Absolutely. And Lear, I know your work at like founding Public Works was pretty significant as well. So did you see any changes there, as to the public is, of course, one of the biggest creators of great content. So like, how did that affect the work you did there?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think, my goodness, that question is almost like its own Zoom, and should have like a collective of the voices who can actually like speak the best to that. But for sure, it's designed, and I think it manifests holistic change. That's the intent. It is values driven, and one of the things that is on my mind now, which I think we've gotten to chat about a little bit, I think, JR, we might have even chatted about this, is that right now, for me, one of the things I'm super inspired by is there's a moment of inspiration within that original federal theater project, right? That I'm like working with a team of colleagues, and I feel like, Jordan, I don't know how you and I have not connected before this moment, but I am looking at you right now. But we, there's an idea that's brewing called One Nation, One Project. And it's inspired by basically a moment in 1937 when 18 cities and towns came together and they each adapted the same play and opened it on the same night, each in their own image, right? So for me, what was incredible about this, the play was Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. It was a popular book that had just come out that everybody knew about, and it was a parable about the threat of fascism. And basically, each city had the freedom to design and interpret their response, including what form they wanted that response to take. And they all, again, it was a unified effort that happened on the same night. But the Birmingham, Alabama production was done as a brass band parade. That is how Birmingham did that play. And in Seattle, there was a company called the Negro Company, an all-Black acting company, and they decided to make their version of It Can't Happen Here about race in Seattle right then, and actually to use the metaphor of fascism. And they did this incredibly brave, culture-changing project that brought in a couple of white actors to play fascists and to kind of tell some truth about what was happening there. And so anyway, looking to do, I know our time is short, but looking to do a similar thing that can actually be, because of the sort of connective tissue of it, is hoping to be part of, again, changing that national narrative and drawing the focus to what is happening at the local level.
Absolutely. And as we wind down here, I'd love to ask one final big question to you all, because we likely will have many artists watching this right now who are very interested in this coming to fruition one of these days. So I would love to ask you all, what are some actionable things that artists and audience members can do to try to forward this momentum and keep this going even past the pandemic, like as we're starting to see vaccines roll out and people announce in-person theater and this sort of kind of scary idea of getting back to whatever normal is now. So what are some actionable things that people can carry with them moving
I was hoping you wouldn't call me
let's
first.
Start with you, no pressure.
I mean, first thing is make work. Many people have continuing to make work during this time, but I'd say continue that, start to show it, and support your fellow artists. I think that's really important. We have to show up for each other and take care of each other. Exercise patience with each other. Everyone's going to have a different level of tolerance for being out in public among other people as we move forward. And that's okay, and that's acceptable. I think, one of the things I hope will hang on to this in this moment that we've had with all the streaming is that it's so accessible. Whether you're a person with disabilities or a person without the financial wherewithal to pay for some of our offerings that have been creeping up in price over the years that maybe we need to rethink. So if you're the one presenting the work, make sure it's accessible both financially and for people who maybe perhaps have mobility issues or health issues. Let's hold on to the best of what we had as we pivoted. Oh, I hate that word too. As we, reinvented this last year, and then do a yes and to the things that we can now do in person as well.
Absolutely, and thank you for mentioning these kind of access barriers, especially the monetary one. I feel like that's another topic onto itself that we could go off on for a while. But one of the important things about the original Federal Theater Project is that it was free. People could just go and just experience theater for free. So
yeah, and I often say if I had unlimited federal funding, one of the many things I would want us to do is just make it so that you never had to pay more than the price of, say, a movie ticket to see art.
Absolutely. Lear, how about you? What should people, what are their marching orders? Let's give some marching orders to people.
Oh, I love it. I think non-arts partnerships, meaning for artists to get involved at, I want to particularly amplify community health centers, which again, we're, I think, working with colleagues, and soon hopefully we'll be sharing this in a bigger way. But you know, there are community health centers all over this country, everywhere, and they think of health in a very holistic way, where you know, they are thinking about truly the health of a whole community, and there is openness to art being, you know, appetite, in fact, for art being part of that recovery. And so many community-based organizations, I think, have that desire as well, but the sort of the bridges are not there. That sort of, I think sometimes those organizations don't know how to, don't have the channels to artists, and artists in many ways are so strapped with trying to figure out how to make it to the end of the week and make a living that capacity is strained. But I think yeah, I think anything, while we try to lift some bigger systems, and I think there are lots of folks working on exactly the type of grassroots stuff that Jordan has been talking about, and there are folks working on arts and public health and arts and city planning, and joining any of those efforts. But at minimum, just committing to be involved at your local level with a partner that is community-based, that's not an arts-based organization.
Absolutely. And then I'll go to Jordan for the last word.
Oh boy, really eloquently to what folks on the ground can do. I'll try to shift a little bit to maybe some bigger policy calls that we're making, and that we invite folks to join with us. And you can reach out to us at the USDAC anytime. We're always happy to hear from folks in the community. But you know, we see three really big priorities in this realm. One, like we've been talking about, join the call to establish a public service jobs program that not only addresses physical infrastructure, but cultural fabric as well. At the local level, we really believe that we can see a lot of change if we expand the percent for art ordinances to include more creative projects like artists in residence, community engaged practices, you know, projects that are working on social cohesion that are led by artists. And then third, you know, we call on folks to direct the existing public service jobs in both public sectors and private sectors to employing artists to mend cultural fabrics that, you know, right now agencies have a budget for public information, for public meetings, for bulletins. If those funds are directed toward theater, toward participatory media, toward public art, toward things that build real meaningful cultural engagement, we can trigger a real cultural change. And so we invite folks to join us in those calls. Feel free to reach out anytime. We're always happy to bring new folks into the fold.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Jordan, we got to connect about your work separately, because we thank you, Jordan, Lear, Greg. Thank you for your time, for your thoughts, for your insight. And thank you everyone for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day.